Good afternoon. I'm very pleased to be here and excited. This is the first time that I'm going to talk about this experience in public, about the experience of being a presidential candidate, what happened. I'm going to share with you some thoughts. I'll say some things, and at the end we will have time to conversate, to talk, to have questions, that I'm sure there is plenty of questions about Colombia and what has happened. But I want to start this presentation saying thanks to Harley, thanks to the Center for Latin American Studies. I'm a very proud Latin American. I'm glad we have Harley. I haven't seen Beatriz around here, but I am happy to be as a Latin American talking to you and showing many things that we can do in this world, and as I say, proud of what we have achieved and what we have done. The first thing is, when we were riding the taxi to the hotel yesterday afternoon, the taxi driver told us it hasn't rained for 5 months here. He said, don't worry, we are going to bring the showers with us. And there you have the showers, and we brought them along from Colombia, where we have plenty of showers, but I'm sure they are going to be very refreshing for this beautiful place. And secondly, as we were walking, coming to here, we were passing in front of the math department building, which is right here. It's not a beautiful building. It's sort of ugly. It has a beautiful view, but it's sort of ugly. And I remember, and this has to do with the presentation now, my advisor, mathematical advisor at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, where I got my Ph.D. in mathematics, was a professor who had graduated from UC Berkeley. And my grandfather, mathematical grandfather as we say, was a professor here, a very famous mathematician, Alfred Tarski. Very important in my life as a mathematician. So when I was coming through here, walking, I never thought that I would come to this place to talk about politics, to talk about being an ex-presidential candidate. And I recall that 30 years ago, I came to Berkeley for the first time, and I spent a month in this town, and I was visiting the Mathematical Science Research Institute, which is at the top of the hill. It's a beautiful institute where mathematicians spend time there thinking in this particular universe where we live. So 30 years later, here I am, this university, passing through the mathematics building, but as a politician. So, and that has to do a lot with what I am and what happens in politics. Because usually we see people, we see candidates who are important people. I was a mayor of Medellin, governor of Antioquia, presidential candidate. People want to have your picture. We are exposed in all senses to anyone in the world right now, actually, the way things go these days. But usually we forget where we come from, where we leaders come from. What's our trajectory in life? What's our story? Mine is particular. Everyone has a particular story. But I am coming into this world after being a mathematician, a mathematical logician of all branches of mathematics, fields of study of mathematics, mathematical logic. And that has a deep impact on the way I am as a human being and as a politician. And usually people make comments. They don't have to know all these details, but having been here, that has made quite an impact in the way I am, as I said, as a person, but as a politician. Mathematical logic is behind many things, behind many of the things that I have done in my life. As a scientist, as a mathematician, as a logician, that reflects on many of the things that I do as a politician. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some lessons. I'm still thinking about many of the things that have happened, but it's very interesting and exciting. This is the leaflet, the first leaflet that we handed out 19 years ago when I got into politics. when we began doing politics in Medellin. After being a tenured full-time professor at the Universidad of Los Andes in Bogotá, I came back to my city, Medellin, with a group of people, and we went on to the streets because we wanted to change the world, we wanted to change Medellin, and we created a civic movement, a political civic movement, people who never thought we would take part in politics. And that's when I began doing politics. And the first leaflet that we handed out in the streets, and I handed out leaflets until 4 months ago, up to 4 months ago, the first leaflet had to do with our political principles. As a mathematician, as a logician, those are the axioms, the very basic concepts that we believed in. And after 19 years, we still have the same principles. That's very important, and that explains many of the things that we do and we have done throughout all these years. I'm going to explain. This is a picture, something that I never thought in my life I would do, come to the streets and hand out leaflets. Never thought that I would do this, and I was doing it, and I have done it for more than 19 years now. And what I'm going to do here is the next slide that I'm going to present. I try to summarize everything that I learned from being mayor and governor with an extraordinary group of people. We worked together, we created these things together, and I just want to summarize what we learned, what we have done, the essence, from my point of view, of all what we have done. Because that's very important when we look at what we do or what we just did as a presidential candidate. We have followed that path. I didn't begin politics as a presidential candidate. We have followed that path for 19 years. So here's the summary. It's a little crowded, but I'll try to explain. And I'm going from the year 2000, January 2000, I went to the streets with this civic movement. I was the candidate for being mayor of Medellin. I have never been in politics before, active politics. I have thought about politics, I have written about politics and things like that, but never taken part as a candidate for anything. So we began doing politics there, walking. And as I said, the first thing that we had in mind and we did was set up, write down the principles. I showed you the first leaflet. We were telling people, these are our principles. Actually, people used to think, what, these guys are crazy, talking about principles and handing out leaflets to people who had never seen any politician handing out leaflets in their lives and talking about the principle, and they will tell me they don't understand these things and say, this is very crucial for us, the principles. And then the way we enter into politics, outside the political traditional parties, we were stating problems. And we said the problems that we want to solve in this city, Medellin, were inequality. This city is very unequal in many senses, Medellin, Antioquia, and Colombia, very unequal in all senses. We have a problem with violence, and we have a very deep problem with corruption and the culture of illegality. Those were the three problems that we stated and said we are going to work on these problems in Medellin, in Antioquia, and actually in Colombia. So we had the principles, we had the problems, and we have a way of doing politics. And the way we did it, and we have done it up to 4 months ago, was walking. We went out to the streets. We were out reaching people in the streets. We didn't have a machinery. We were fighting the worst problem that we have from my point of view, which is the entrance door to the corruption world, clientelism. And we went out directly to people, walking the streets. We walked, we listened to people, we talked to people, we studied the city. So we put all those things together for years. And then we managed to get the city in our hearts, our skin, and our brain. And that's a way of summarizing how we interacted with the people, how we got involved with the city, and that's where we began. And as I say, I have been doing the same thing for 19 years. Exactly the same thing, following the same path. During the presidential campaigns, I would be handing out leaflets. I remember thinking in Bogotá, one of the entrances of Bogotá, 9 lines, cars all around, and I said, now I'm 62 years old, And I said, after all these years, I'm still in the streets, I'm still handing out leaflets in a car, talking to people. Now we have selfies and all these things. I said, 19 years of my life, I've been doing this. Exactly the same. Getting in touch with people. People will say, don't waste your time. How many people can you see there? But if you have a video in Facebook, you will reach millions. But we have kept doing that throughout all these years. We have learned a lot. And here is a summary of the crucial things that we have learned and what we have done. First, we have bet on dignity of people. We have always had respect and recognition. And always, whenever we have done something in politics, we have bet on people's and communities' capacities. During the presidential campaign, the jingle associated with me was the professor. It used to be, few years ago, a way of diminishing you, calling you professor, as President Santos did to Antanas Mockus 8 years ago, was a way of saying he's from a lower level, because in our society, being a professor was to me that we were in a lower echelon within society. And my jingle associated with me in the project that we had was a professor. And at the end, the last debate that we had as the presidential candidate, all of the candidates were saying, I am also a professor. That was interesting and funny and very meaningful, because we meant something, and I am very proud of. So when you are a professor, those of us who are professors, and that's my definition, a mathematician, a scientist, a logician, a professor, we always, when we interact with people, we want to get the best out of each one. That's the definition of being a professor. Those professors that you remember are those guys who have tried to get the best out of you. To destroy is very easy. To get something positive of a human being right in front of us, it's quite a different way of relating to people. And we always relate to people's capacities. Everyone has a capacity, communities have capacities. This is crucial for all what we have done, all what I have done, and I use an individual statement. The means justify the end. It has to do with logic. It's the path that we follow in order to get to a place that determines what's the value of where you get. It's completely opposed to the end justify the means. Whatever you have to do in order to get to a place. And I said, no, it's not whatever you have to do in order to get to a place. It's the path that you follow, and how you follow the path that determines the value of the place where you get at. That's a way of looking at life and understanding the world. And that's crucial for all what we do and all what we have done. And at the end, what we have built throughout all these years is trust. And trust is the raw material that we need in order to transform our society. And trust is built. You cannot buy trust. Trust is built, and I have a little formula here that says trust is being coherent plus consistent. And that means that every step that we take doesn't contradict the previous steps, and we always respect the same principles from the very first day until today. We all will respect the same principle as we move along. And that's the crucial thing behind what we have done in politics. So, and then we have gotten and we have governed. We got into power. And we govern following the path that we were following in order to get to power. We got into politics because we wanted to get into power. We wanted to change the world, and we lead that transformation. And we learned how to govern with wonderful people. Everything that I say here, I have had around and have worked with extraordinary people. And we know how to govern with transparency, which is the crucial feature in order to fight corruption, which is a disease that we have throughout Latin America and throughout the world in many places. We knew governing as a pedagogy, explaining things, explain to people, explain what you're doing. Connect to people, connect people from different sectors of society. We managed to build spaces where we get together, where we could be different, but we can handle our differences in a place where we will be respecting each other. That is meant in two dimensions. The agreements or disagreements that we may have viewing society, and at the same place, the same way, at the same time, building spaces where we can get together, physical spaces in the city where we can get together to be fighting the worst thing that we have had, which is fear associated with violence. We know how to integrate, how to work together to come up and confront problems and work together in the solution of problems. We know what it means to empower people, empower citizens, empower communities by the way we do politics. Because we walk, we listen, we paid attention, we talked, and we established a relationship with people, which was a direct relationship in governing. And I'm very proud of what I'm saying. We knew how to empower people to transform communities and societies. And of course, the key word was education as the engine of social transformation. Education has to do with education in the traditional sense. It has to do with science, technology, innovation, entrepreneurship, culture as a way of getting the best, the better out of people and communities. That's the essence of what we have done in politics after all these years. And I love this phrase that we came up with after we finished in Medellin, and we moved from fear to hope. And building hope requires, as I say, from the way we have done things, this is the summary of what we have done. After doing this, then we move on to Colombia. I was the one who was a mayor, a governor, and then looking to be a president of Colombia, understanding a city, complex city, a state, a complex state, and then we moved on to try to lead Colombia. But this is the path that we have followed. Everything that you saw when we were in that campaign was somehow related to this story. A very brief history of recent Colombia. Now I moved to Colombia. We could say that everything began in 1982 with Belisario Betancourt, who was the president of Colombia. Actually, I didn't live in Colombia at that time. I was studying here. And that's the first time that there was a real negotiation in these times with the guerrillas. Guerrillas were a factor. Narco-trafficking was just beginning in Colombia, just at that time. Then we had Virgilio Barco, who had to deal with guerrillas and narco-traffickers, violence, terror. We saw directly the destruction associated with narco-traffic in Colombia. Then came Cesar Gaviria, who was the president of Colombia because Luis Carlos Galán, who was deemed to be Colombia's president, was assassinated by narco-traffickers, among a group of people who were killed systematically by narco-traffic in Colombia. And in 1991, we had a new constitution associated with the government of Cesar Gaviria. Then Gaviria had to deal with guerrillas, narco-traffickers, as part of the destruction of violence in our country. Then came Ernesto Samper, 1994, associated with narco-traffic and the way narco-traffic got involved with politics. Then came Andrés Pastrana, a conservative, and he tried to have a peace process with the FARC, which was a failed peace process, and it was a moment where Colombia was at a very low level, despair, frustration, and resignation in many senses. And then came Álvaro Uribe, 2002. And he came and became president from having 5% in the polls when the presidential race began, and he won in the first round, la primera vuelta. How do you say that in English? First round? And the first round. After the failed peace process of Andrés Pastrana with FARC, and there was a figure, a picture, a symbol that showed President Pastrana sitting in a table and an empty chair by his side where there was supposed to be the leader of the FARC, and he didn't show up. And that was an example of Colombia, what was happening. And then came Álvaro Uribe and said, I'm going to fix this, and we are going to fight him. And here we are. And then I wrote this title this morning saying, From Hope to Trouble, a Missed Opportunity. I'm going to explain myself a little bit. We are getting together. I mean, we are just about to get 2018, but I have to go through these steps. Álvaro Uribe changed the Constitution. We had re-election for the first time in Colombia. We didn't have re-election. Our terms were for 4 years. When he was president, they changed the Constitution, so he was allowed to be re-elected. He was re-elected, he won in the first round, and he governed Colombia from 2002 to 2010. In 2010, we had an election, and Santos was the candidate associated with Uribe. And then Mocus, Antanas Mocus, former mayor of Bogota, and myself, we were facing them. I was a vice presidential candidate with Antanas Mocus as our presidential candidate. And we finished second. We went on to a second round, and we didn't win, but at that time was a first signal saying there is something happening in Colombia. Things are changing. There was a reaction associated with the government of Álvaro Uribe. President Santos, he had been before the Minister of Commerce with Cesar Gaviria. He had been the Minister of Finances with Andrés Pastrana, and he was the Minister of Defense with Álvaro Uribe. He was a member of the establishment, and he was chosen. He had never taken part in any election, popular election, and the first one that he had was for president, and he was elected president here, and he represented Uribe. And that's the reason why he won the election. He was Uribe's representative. And then happened something that nobody expected. And I'm saying these things so that I can introduce you to where we are right now. And at that time, Santos came up with the peace negotiations. We didn't know about his intentions. But in a sense, he was the only one in Colombia who could lead such a negotiations with the FARC. The idea was, with Uribe, they have fought FARC, they have been reduced. Santos was the Minister of Defense, and now it's time for negotiations. And the negotiations began, and then immediately Uribe and Santos were fighting each other, because Uribe didn't agree with the way Santos was handling the government and the way he was handling the presidential, the peace negotiations. The year 2004, then we had an election where Zuluaga, Oscar Iván Zuluaga, was the candidate associated with Uribe, who was in opposition to Santos because of the peace negotiations, and they were facing Santos, and Santos was the president who was dealing with peace. I'm sorry, I wrote it here in Spanish, I realized. And then that was the first election that Uribe lost in his life, 2014. But that loss became something very sad for us in Colombia, which has plenty to do with what we are living today, because 2 years ago today, we had a plebiscite in Colombia. Colombians, we were asked about the peace deals that Santos had been carrying out with FARC, and we were asked to vote on whether we agreed with it or not. And to the surprise, I think all of us, the no vote won. And we lost the plebiscite. Those of us who were hoping that we would be voting yes and it would be approved. And actually we thought that it would be approved by quite a majority. the result was that the no won. And then, from then on, we are in deep trouble. And that has quite an impact in Colombia. And I'm going to explain to you what has happened in these last 2 years, including until today, but that was a crucial point. And that no was led by Uribe, opposed to Santos, and unfortunately, we lost. And that changed, for me, it has changed Colombia's life. I'll explain. But I'm going to talk a little bit about Colombia. Actually, we have been, roughly speaking, in campaign for the last 2 years and a half. Because during the year 2016, we had the campaign for the plebiscite. Then, in 2017, we had to collect signatures in order to present our candidates. ¿Cómo se dice? Candidatura? Candidacy? Okay. So we were in the streets looking for the signatures. Then, this year, 2018, we had the Congress election. Then we had the presidential election. And then we had the Anti-Corruption Consult. So for the last 2 years and a half, somehow we have been campaigning. It's tough. 2 years and a half, basically, in terms of campaigning, and today we are now campaigning for next year. Now, so I'm going to talk a little bit about this beautiful country, Colombia. Here it is. And this is one way of presenting what Colombia is. And my daughter, Mariana, gave me this picture, and I said, that's the one that I want to introduce Colombia. Colombia, we have close to 10% of the species in the world. We can find them in Colombia, which has less than 1% of the surface of the world, of the earth. And you can see that we have in Colombia 20% of the aves. How do you say aves? Birds, butterflies, orchids, and so on. Colombia is a very rich country. Our biodiversity is extraordinary. We are the second most biodiverse country in the world. We are very proud of saying this after Brazil. But Brazil is huge compared to us. And Colombia has this condition and something extraordinary about Colombia. I'm going to tell you about what I have seen throughout Colombia. I was a vice presidential candidate in 2010. 8 years later, Colombia has changed quite a lot. Many interesting things have happened. And one of the things is, in Colombia, we are conscious. In every small town in Colombia, people in those towns are conscious of the environment. We are conscious of that we are very rich, and happily, worldwide, we know that biodiversity is quite a richness for a society. It wasn't like that 10 years ago. It wasn't like that when we began doing politics in the year 2000. But today, we are aware of being very rich. In every town in Colombia, people are worried about water, what is happening with the water, and with our biodiversity. That's quite a change in our country. I'll say more things about Colombia. The Colombia that I have seen, and I'm talking first person here because I've been walking throughout all these years, walking and talking to people in the streets and seeing around. That's one of the extraordinary things of being a candidate. The possibility of going throughout a country, talking to everyone around as much as we can. Colombia has 50 million people. That's our population. Colombia is big. Colombia is big, and we have plenty of people. And Colombia is a country which is fragmented. Our geography helps. We have the Andes Mountains, we have the Caribbean, we have the Pacific coast. We are always, I remember when we were in geography class as a kid, saying we are the only South American country that has a coast on the Caribbean, on the Pacific. And we were very proud of being the only ones in South America that had that. Actually, Panama used to belong to us. Anyway, but I always have to make that little comment. But Colombia is fragmented. the mountains that we have, the rivers that we have through, we have Colombia's population spread throughout. Colombia has plenty of big cities throughout the country. And we are very diverse and very disconnected. Very difficult to go from one place to another in Colombia throughout years. So we have many diverse, different cultures. That makes for diversity. Very different cultures. One expression of that, for example, that is beautiful about Colombia, in Colombia, in every town there is music. Colombia is a country that dances. There's music all throughout the territory, very different musics. And we are very proud of our artists, our singers, and you can see, and they have been an important part, I think, in what they are now. They are worldwide known. But Colombia is fragmented. Colombia is very unequal. Whichever way you want to make inequality, if you look at the top of the table, you will find Colombia at the top, in Latin America and worldwide. Very unequal. Medellin is extremely unequal. Antioquia and Colombia are very unequal with regard to peoples, the Gini coefficient, for example, but any other measure that you want to have to measure inequality, then Colombia is at the top. Colombia is outraged, is indignant now. And the main fact of this condition, which is new, is corruption. The effect that the indignation about what has happened with corruption, which began with this name from Brazil, this company from Brazil, Odebrecht, which has shown throughout Latin America the size of corruption at the highest level, because usually it was said that people in the countryside, far from Bogota, they were corrupt, but they were very far from the center. And what Odebrecht showed us is the level of corruption, and it's a system that we have in Colombia throughout Latin America, and corruption is there, and suddenly people realize they are stealing our money. The corrupt politicians are taking away our money, and they are affecting us. So you put together a very unequal society with the corruption and the indignation that people has around corruption, and that creates some particular atmosphere and conditions in the citizens of Colombia. Colombia is afraid. We have had, I showed you this timetable. I mean, we have been dealing with violence, guerrillas, narcotraffic, paramilitary people. We have had all these things. So we are afraid. We have seen violence in extremes that nobody has seen. And we are not proud of that, and that's painful. Colombia is sore. We have close to 8 million victims throughout all these years because of the violence. And those victims haven't been repaired. And there's plenty of pain throughout Colombia. We are a sore society in many senses. Now, that Colombia, and I'm not proud of saying what I'm describing here, but we have to understand it, but it's a resilient society. Colombia is tremendous in the resilience of their people throughout all these calamities. But Colombia always has had a way of moving forward, surviving in many senses, a resilient society. Diverse, as I mentioned, culturally diverse, is richness. If we know how to use that diversity, we have plenty of richness for us in Colombia. Colombia is an intelligent society. People in Colombia are intelligent, talented, smart throughout the country. With all this, what time is it? Okay, just a second. We are very rich. I talked about biodiversity. In Colombia, is more educated. The middle class has been getting bigger. Less poverty and a bigger middle class. But, and this is a mathematical part of the conference, there doesn't exist a positive national project that unites us. In Colombia, we have never had something positive that we could say we have rallied behind this. We have had this in our minds, it's our national project. We have been united by guerrillas. People in general, people were against the guerrillas. But that's something that meant destruction. And we were together, afraid. We have been united, I'm simplifying, against narco-traffic. We have been united today against corruption, but those are negative factors. We have never had a common national project which bet on something positive about us. And the missed opportunity that we had was building the peace in Colombia. That's, for me, that's the failure. That's something very sad in our society, because that was the moment where we had the opportunity to do something together and building the peace. And that was impossible because the plebiscite was lost, and then we haven't been able to build peace after going through the peace accords that signed President Santos. And we are still looking for a project, a national project that can put us, all of us, together, moving in a direction where we can say we are united somehow. Here is a picture. You may know Jorge Robledo, Polo Democrático Alternativo, Claudia López, Alianza Verde, and Sergio Fajardo, Compromiso Ciudadano. We got together in the 20th of December last year, 2017. And for the first time, we were working together after 6 months of having conversations among ourselves. We wrote down a document that established what we agreed on. We were very different. I always said this throughout the campaign, said, I never in my life I have crossed a single word with Jorge Robledo. I have never talked to him. But we worked, we sat down, we reviewed everything, we discussed every detail, and we came up with a program that said we can be together around this particular program. It was a coalition called Coalición Colombia, which was built after discussions, work, and we worked together. And I'm going to explain now, this is the last one, and then I'll stop so that we can have a conversation. I was the presidential candidate for that coalition, and what we did was a campaign for Congress, working together for the first time, as I said, El Polo Democrático, in charge of, or the group of the Polo Democrático that works with Jorge Robledo, Alianza Verde, and Compromiso Ciudadano, the movement that I have led from 19 years on. And we worked together and came to the Congress election, where we had quite a success. When I say we, it's because we worked together. We managed to have, for example, 15 senators, counting the senators from the Polo Democrático and Alianza Verde, something that increased more than double what we had before. And we had the representatives for the Cámara of Representantes, the House of Representatives, and with working together with Alianza Verde and El Polo Democrático, we had a very good representation in Congress in Colombia. And I was the presidential candidate at that time. The Congress election was March 11, and when we finished with this success for Congress, suddenly we had a political situation, or not suddenly, but the political situation that we had was, we had two candidates that were elected in the primaries, each one on their particular side. Gustavo Petro in one side, Iván Duque in another side. The one I should have written Duque más Uribe. He's the candidate of Uribe for this. It's no minor comment. I should have written it down in there. And when we finished March 11, that election, we had the country has been, and that was the common expression, polarized. Petro against Duque Uribe, Fajardo, myself in representation of the Coalición Colombia, lagging behind. We were, at a time, 17 points behind Gustavo Petro. Here's Natalia Garviras, who is a student here, who worked with us. She went to Colombia and worked during the campaign with us. And suddenly we had a political situation where it was Petro against Duque, polarization, and these were the common words that moved around. Fear, uncertainty, hate, resentment, destruction, revenge. there was a confrontation between these two guys who had come through the primaries with plenty of attention. Petro was mobilizing crowds, huge crowds in the streets, unbelievable manifestations. And Duque was moving around, coming from the party of Uribe, Uribe's party. He had been chosen. He was the different one among the group of people who had been aspiring to be Uribe's representatives, the Centro Democrático's representatives. And the political setting is like these two guys. And that's the confrontation. We were lost. I was the leader then, the candidate of the presidential, our coalition, and we were lost. A month before the election, I was lagging 17 points behind Petro. And we continued working. We never surrendered. We continue working, explaining, going through the discussions that we have in a presidential election, debates, campaigning. I was called the worm. I wasn't strong. I didn't insult anyone. So I was called weak. Poor guy. Look at these leaders. They are facing each other. They are real machos in political terms. And this is a wimp. He doesn't attack. He doesn't insult anyone. He's talking about fighting corruption, education, and building, and getting together in a different sense. And here I was, completely lost in political terms. That was supposed to be the case. At the end, when the election day came, Petro got 25%. I got 24% after being 17 points behind. A month before the election, Duque got 39%. Vargas Lleras, another establishment candidate, 7%. And Humberto de la Calle, who was the leader of the peace negotiation, got 2% in representation of the Liberal Party. And that's what happened during the first round. We almost got there, almost. We lost. When we lost, I said, we lost. We have to learn how to win and to lose, respect what has happened. I never asked, let's have a recount of the votes because this is very close. That was the result, that was the result. We have to work on what's happening in the year 2019, and we have done an extraordinary campaign. After being lost in completely political terms, we ended up almost winning, but almost is not enough. And that's a lesson that we have to have in life. And then came the second round. Maybe you will have a question for the second round, so I'm not going to say it, but I'm going to wait for your questions for the second round. But I advanced something. So it was Petro against Duque. We were 3 persons, actually 4 persons in La Coalición Colombia, because Antanas Mocus had joined us. He became a candidate for the Senate, for the Green Party, Green Alliance, and we were 4 guys, Robledo, Claudia, Antanas, and myself, who were the leaders of the Coalición Colombia. And for the second round, each one, we had talked about among ourselves, each one will take the decision that each one of us wanted to take. Claudia Lopez rallied behind Petro, Antanas Mocus rallied behind Petro, and Robledo vote, ¿cómo se dice votar en blanco? Blank vote? No, but it's not abstaining. Abstaining means you didn't go to the polls. You went there and you, white vote. Let's say the white vote, anyway. And I vote white vote, and Robledo vote white vote. Petro, then the second round came. Petro got 42%, something extraordinary. Actually, here had happened something extraordinary. For the first time in Colombia's history, people who didn't belong to the traditional political parties would defeat the traditional establishment, the traditional political parties. This has never happened before. And in the second round, Petro got 42%, Duque 54%. He was elected president. And this vote was extraordinary in Colombia's history, what he got. Then, now we have Duque as president for a month and a half, almost 2 months now. He was he inaugurated August the 7th, and he's our president right now. Plenty of things have happened. Many things are happening. The most outstanding fact that happened after the 7th of August, which was this anti-corruption consultation, led by Claudia Lopez from the year 2017, they collected signatures in order to be able to bring to Colombian people a consultation against corruption. And the time came, it was the 27th of August, where people in Colombia were asked to vote on this consultation. Nobody expected what happened. We almost got to the point where the number of votes that were needed in this consultation would make sure that the consultation would have to go to Congress. Almost, very little. It was, let's say, we needed 12,300,000 votes, and the consultation got 11,700,000 votes, 700,000 votes, but very little. But it was extraordinary, but it was an election that we have never had before. Nobody had any incentive different of being, I'm going to manifestate against corruption in Colombia. Nobody had ever thought that this number of people could come freely to the polls to vote. And this was an extraordinary message from Colombian people. So this is all what has happened throughout these years, through this election. I want to make 2 additional comments about Colombia and what I saw as a presidential candidate, and as I said, to let you ask questions so that I can answer whichever ones I can answer. Now, I said, every town is conscious about the environment. That's something extraordinary. It's a change. It's a huge change that we are having in Colombia. Secondly, it's very powerful. In every town, also there is a sense, we are conscious about the play that women play the place that women should have in our society. It's extraordinary. The advancement of the understanding of women's development as part of our society is a very interesting characteristic in Colombia, all over. And in addition to that, we have a young generation which is extraordinary. Those students who are right now at the university level, let's say, are not students who are usually, it was to be a caricature, a cartoon, where said these kids, the young people, spend their time with their cell phone, looking and playing games and so on. But what we have in Colombia right now is a generation which is smart, is connected to what is happening in the country, is participating in politics, is voting, something that was very strange in our society, that young people wouldn't vote because they would be lazy. They would say, I don't want to go Sunday morning to go to vote, but it's an extraordinary generation that we have in Colombia. So that's the Colombia that we have. Something extraordinary is happening in there. It's happening right now. What happens next remains to be seen, but that's a view of Colombia and the way we have been taking part in politics since 19 years ago. I'm very proud to be telling you what we have achieved, what we have advanced, the changes in our country, the difficulties that we are facing, because we are facing contradictions, dilemmas, paradoxes throughout Colombia, but that's the Colombia that we have. So I want to stop there so that we can have a conversation and, okay.
Now we have time for questions. I would ask you to keep your questions brief so we can have as many as possible. Single questions, and we will ask for several at a time. So who would like to begin? Yes.
In El Salvador, of course, there was a very large guerrilla movement for many years, and then it became a political movement that has had some success. I'm wondering whether you think the FARC will have a similar impact on Colombian society if it becomes a political organization, and then of course not all of the guerrillas disarmed. The ELN, I believe, is still in the field. And I just wondered what you thought the role of the ex-guerrillas would be in Colombia compared to, say, El Salvador.
Okay.
Yes. Please wait for the mic, yes.
Oh, sorry.
Sure.
I was in Colombia during the second round, and I'm going to ask you a question that I asked all my friends, which is, why isn't Fajardo encouraging his supporters to vote for Petro? Why did you do the white vote?
Okay.
Okay. And over here.
Senor Fajardo, thank you so much for joining us and sharing. Since the peace accord and the FARC surrendering arms, there's been an escalation of social leaders and indigenous leaders disappearing. And I'm curious to hear your perspective of what is this transition looking like? What are you seeing? And is there any evidence of where this is coming from exactly?
Okay.
Let me commend the first three questioners for the brevity and directness of their questions. So,
Okay. Shall I answer this?
yes, yes.
Okay. The first and the third are very, let's say, the situation is very frustrating and it's dangerous in Colombia. Santos was, as I mentioned, the one person in Colombia, of course it's an exaggeration, but in political terms, he was, from my point of view, the one person who could ask the country to go on into a negotiation with FARC. He came from the establishment, he was the candidate of Uribe, from Bogota, he represented the elite in our country. So he could ask that elite to get into a negotiation with FARC. And he negotiated with all the difficulties that negotiation had. But once the plebiscite was lost, that was very difficult because he did, with his government, he took into account some of the points that the no people, headed by Uribe, were having with respect to the negotiation, the accords that we were offered to vote on. And he made some arrangements, but from then on, they moved to the Congress, and from then on, the no people, Uribe, established a confrontation with Santos saying, we won, so there should be no peace accord, because we won. And then, from then on, life was almost impossible for Santos as a president. And what has happened, and it has been my opinion, and I express it throughout all these years, was unfortunately Santos didn't have the condition to lead the country into building the peace. He could negotiate, and he did it, but he didn't have the conditions in order to move the country into building peace, which, as I mentioned before, I said that was the opportunity that we had in Colombia to do something positive where we could rally from all sectors in order to build something that would make sense for all of us in Colombia, building peace. And he didn't have the ability. But not only he didn't have the ability, but the troublesome situation that we are living right now is that the state, the key issue in building peace has to do where the guerrillas were, the state should get in there, replace them with the state, the legal state, providing the conditions for the communities. That's the very basic step. They were here, they move out because they signed a peace treaty, and then you have the state going in there. And it hasn't happened in Colombia. And it's very unfortunate because as time goes by, then we have had, maybe you have heard of this, dissidences. People who were supposed to be within the peace agreement, but they have left, they didn't abide by the peace agreement, and they are forming groups as they are now narco-traffickers. And in those communities where we were hoping to have peace, we have not had peace. We have had many social leaders being killed, and we have another chapter of violence. And this dream that we have of building the peace is in deep trouble. It's very difficult, the situation that we have in some parts of the country. Colombia has a condition which is, roughly speaking, we are close to 80% living in urban centers. So the countryside, after all these years, has been left behind. So many of these things are happening far from the urban centers that we have in Colombia. And my real worry, and I think many people in Colombia, is that if we don't move quickly to occupy those spaces and show how you can get into the countryside, get into agriculture, the development of the agricultural sector in Colombia, and bring peace to these territories, then we are going back to another chapter where we have narco-traffickers, and now they are called bandas criminales, and associated with narco-traffic. And the way President Duque is handling this is associating everything with narco-traffic, fighting narco-traffickers in the countryside, in the cities, the way they are handling the security issues and the personal dose, which has been a discussion in Colombia about what happens to people who have a personal dose of some sort of drug. And if we don't move quickly to occupy those spaces, many of the hopes that we have are going to be lost. And FARC is not becoming a political party that is going to be having a political presence in Colombia. Actually, in the previous election, they participated in the election for Congress, and they had very few votes because the FARC didn't have a real contact with the communities, with the citizens in Colombia. So politically, they are very weak. There is an agreement that has to be respected, but it hasn't been implemented, and we are in trouble. That's what I think about what is happening, and one of the issues associated with that is the killing of social leaders throughout the countryside in those places where we should have had the state occupying the space, and we never got in there. That's really worrying, and it's very painful, and I hope this can be stopped. As of now, I don't see any chance of having a negotiation with ELN, and that's very sad, but that's the challenge that we have in Colombia right now. Now, the second question was, and I said I'm going to vote white. That sounds strange when I say it in English. I'm going to vote white, blank, okay, blank. And I wrote down why I voted blank. And it was a personal vote where I explained why I voted for blank. I have spent all these months saying Colombia shouldn't be having Duque, Uribe as president, nor Petro. And I showed the difference that we had as a coalition I myself had with those two candidates. We were in a competence, and I explained every time why we were different, and I wrote down why I wouldn't vote for either one. And I explained it. I didn't campaign for people voting blank. I said everyone has the right to choose whoever you want to choose, and that's why I explained from the very beginning being coherent, consistent throughout all these years. We had some aspects in common with Petro. One, and it's an important one, we both were for peace. The other ones were for no peace. We voted yes, but we had many differences in the way we understood Colombia, the way we understood politics, the way we have handled politics, how we have governed. I explained a little, and he means confrontation. He means revenge. A populist in many senses. Very smart, very capable. He came on to the second round, and I didn't complain about it. But that's very different from the politics that we have done before, from fear to hope. We never inspire fear, we always inspire hope. We didn't come to a confrontation, we went to bring the best out of everyone. We were building a space where we can get together from different sectors. And that's what I think that Colombia needed and Colombia needs today. And that's the reason why, or one of the main reasons why, when I wrote down, and I wrote it down myself, I said I vote blank because these reasons, and those are one of the reasons that I did. We got together with Robledo and Claudia Lopez. We wrote it down. We discussed it for 6 months. And we came out with a program that we had built together. And that was our construction. And that was the reason why I voted blank. There are more details, but roughly speaking, and I hope it satisfies you, that was, and let me add this, I just said it, but I'll repeat it. I didn't campaign for saying, people vote blank. I said, everyone, make your own decision. I deeply believe it has to do with logic, principles. Every vote is an independent vote. I don't have votes. Every act of voting is a particular act, is a decision that every individual has to take. And as I said, Claudia Lopez and Antanas Mocus vote for Petro, campaign strongly for him, and I never complained about that, never said they shouldn't do that. Robledo voted black, and that was the reason why I did it. Now, I'm going to add a political commentary. Nobody thought that what we did would happen. We were 17 % behind Petro 1 month before the election. And we were moving up and getting closer and closer and closer. Actually, I used the figure of something that Colombians love, we Colombians love, which is bicycle racing. And we are very good mountain climbing. So I said, we are going through this huge climb, very long climb that we have in Colombia. And I'm climbing, and I'm going to capture them at the very end. And we were doing that, and moving, and moving, and moving. Actually, all the polls would say, if Fajardo comes to the second round, he will be the only one who could beat Duque and Uribe. I never complained about that. I could say, don't vote for Petro, vote for me because I am the one who is going to defeat Duque and Uribe. I would say that. Say, I am the one. When I say I, with the Coalition Colombia, we can defeat them. But we didn't beat Petro, and I respected that, and I never complained. I never complained because the people who vote for De La Calle didn't vote for me. We tried to get together. I never complained. I always respect the people's decision, and I'm not sour grapes. I said, these are the reasons, these are the arguments that we talked about during the campaign, and that was a detail. If I had come to the second round, I would be Colombia's president, I couldn't be here today. But that's life. And we have to learn how, and that's important for the country. We gave arguments. I was called warm. I was called weak. You are not strong because you don't confront people. You never insult anyone. You are very passive, very warm. Said, and here we are. But I honor our word, reasons, arguments, and that's part of the lessons that people learn in a society. We are in a competition. That's democracy. You vote, and we have kept for 19 years this same path that we have been following. Okay, that's an important question, and it's a difficult one, and I have had plenty of comments.
Okay, we'll do 3 more. Please keep them brief. Yes. Right there.
The Colombia that my parents grew up in was pretty much strictly bipartisan, and I'm sure it was all liberales and conservadores exclusively. And now, in the most recent decades, we've got into a culture of political pluralism. What factors contributed to this more plural, it's not entirely plural, but more plural political environment, and how can we stay on that path?
Okay.
Yes. Could you wait 1 second?
Sorry. How would you have to change, and how would Colombia have to change for you to be elected president?
And one more over there. Yes. You. Yes. Mm-hmm. She's right over there.
Thank you, Professor. I wanted to ask about clientelism in Colombia, and you said you almost got to the point that you needed in this anti-corruption effort. What are the next steps in that? How have you seen that change over time? You've been fighting this battle for 19 years. So where do we go from here in that battle?
Okay. More questions? To finish, let's take all of...
Yes, we'll take 2 more questions. We are very time constrained. So the one way in the back, yes.
Thank you. So my question is, to which extent could we talk about Duque's victory as a reaction to the Venezuelan crisis?
Okay.
And one more over here. And this will be our last question. Yes.
Thank you. Medellin was well known before by everybody for the Medellin cartel. Now it's one of the most desirable cities to live in Colombia, from what I understand. And I wonder if your being a mayor had something to do with it, and what did you do to make the change?
I didn't understand the last part.
When you were mayor of Medellin, were you involved in the process of changing Medellin from being a very dangerous city to a very desirable city, a very welcoming city? And what did you do to make the change?
Okay. Okay. Actually, these questions are all sort of related in the way I can answer them. Colombia has changed quite a lot. And we complain, and I explained, I mentioned some of the difficult things that we had, but I have no doubt that Colombia, and I mentioned it there, is more educated, the middle class is growing, and we have plenty of favorable things for our country. And undoubtedly, it's my claim, the traditional political parties are over. I don't know how they can react, they will try to reappear, but the Liberal Party and the Conservative Party are over. Actually, La U, Centro Democrático, Cambio Radical, they are all spin-offs of those parties, and at the end they are very similar. So that's why we say those are the traditional political parties, the political establishment, putting all those together. But since we have had the elections for mayors and governors because before that, they were named by the president. Governors of the states and mayors of the cities were named by the president of the country. Since we have had those elections, things have been changing in Colombia. And we have had examples of people who had been elected to be mayors. Antanas Mocus is a prime example. For me, it was an inspiration. I used to live in Bogota, and I saw him when he got into politics, and the way, an alternative way of doing politics changed Bogota deeply. He was a crucial person in opening up the possibilities of politics. Then we saw that things could be done differently, and that society could be changed. And it wasn't that we were following exactly what he did, but he did something that was crucial for changing Medellin and different places that we have had throughout Colombia. It was, you have to do politics differently, and you have to face clientelism that is the entrance door to corruption. And with those examples, throughout some other cities in Colombia, we began seeing the possibility of doing politics differently in a country which is very urban, as I mentioned. It's close to 80% lives in urban centers, and with more education, people are getting better and better at voting, are paying more attention. As I mentioned, we have a new generation which is outstanding. The young generation that we have in Colombia, women are playing a role, and Colombia is changing. And that has shown us the way of being able to do politics in a different way. We had the 2010 election with Mocus as our presidential candidate, which was called the Green Wave. There was hope in there. And what happened in this election showed Colombia has deeply changed. We still have to move on to cities throughout Colombia. But I think this path is irreversible. We have differences, and it's not an easy discussion that we have, and it sometimes is a difficult discussion, but Colombia is very different, and Colombian people we are in a different level, and I think that, as I said, is irreversible. We are moving forward in that sense. And the first thing that we did in Medellin was change politics, as explained there. The way you get into power, and this has to do with something very deep that I wrote down there. The means are the ones that justify the end. The way you get into power determines how you govern. That's why I insist all the time about the process, the being coherent, being consistent, how you get into power. Because the path that you follow will determine how you will be in government. And I believe in that, and I think that lesson has been learned throughout the country. It's not an easy battle. We have to fight corruption. The Anti-Corruption Consultation that we had was a very powerful message from Colombia. As I said, Colombia is indignant, outraged, because we understood that corruption was a system that we have in Colombia. Not only in remote regions of Colombia, people would steal the money for school lunches throughout the country, but we understood that it was a system that has a root in Bogota, in the power of the central government, and throughout Colombia. And being unequal and being corrupt, and the sensations of people have in Colombia, that has changed the way we think at it. Now, this anti-corruption consultation has translated into Congress, and they should have some new laws that would fight corruption. But that's just a first step, very powerful step. What happened was very powerful in political terms. We didn't win, and this was led by Claudia Lopez and Angelica Lozano. They were the leaders of this. We didn't get the votes, but in Congress they are discussing this consultation as if we have had the votes, because the congressmen, and people understood this is something very powerful happening in Colombia. But that's just one first step, a very powerful step that we needed. And then what comes next? And that chapter has to be written in Colombia. And we have to think about how to fight corruption in the local and regional elections, in the local and regional governments, because this is dealing with Congress, but we have to get throughout Colombia. That's a political challenge that we have. And as I said, in Medellin, the first step, crucial step, was change politics. We came from outside the traditional political party. We never negotiated with them. We came into power in a way that when we came into power, we could build something new, unexpected in the city of Medellin. Bring people from different sectors, bring them together. And we had the NGOs, social organization, the academic world, the cultural world. We were alternative, but we created a space where we can talk and we can work together. And we understood very deeply, very carefully. We knew about it, we have seen it, we have studied, we have lived it, what it meant to be unequal, the violence and the culture of illegality and corruption. And we were able to govern with transparency. We bet on education in that wide sense that I talked when I talk about education, and we were able to make a profound impact. Medellin hasn't solved the problems. We are going through difficult times, and leaders have to understand every condition, being able to transform, to continue transforming, not living out of something that was very good at a given moment and keep doing the same thing. Which you have to transform. You have to understand what is happening to society, how the culture is changing, and that's a challenge that we have in Medellin and throughout Colombia. And you asked about Venezuela and if the Duque's election has to do with what is happening with Venezuela. I don't think the election, he won because what is happening in Venezuela, but what is happening in Venezuela has a very deep impact in Colombia. Now, the discussion, when it got to Duque Uribe versus Petro, the first, one of the main points was Duque and Uribe saying, Petro is Castro Chavista. Look at Venezuela, look at what is happening there, look at Cuba and Venezuela, Castro and Chavez, and see what is happening there. And this guy wants us to be like Venezuela. Petro has been friends with Chavez. And that was one of the factors that had to do with the fear that many people in Colombia would have associated with Petro. Not because what is happening in the sense that what is happening, but it was a very easy way to say, look at that, and this guy is like that, which was a way of the discussion that was carried out within the presidential campaign. So in that sense, that was one of the factors that associated Petro with something negative, associated with fear within Colombia. So maybe it has to do with Venezuela, one of those factors. Actually, during the campaign, Duque and Uribe were saying, FARC, look at FARC. Those had been signed the treaty with the accord with Santos, the government, and they represent Castro and Chavez. And they were always saying, look at the FARC. They are, with all the money that they have, they are going to buy a lot of votes, clientelism. They are going to get a lot of votes, and they are going to lead us to Venezuela. And FARC got 85,000 votes for Congress. So that argument disappeared. FARC were not a political party that would challenge Colombia, the different movements in political terms. And those were associated with Venezuela, Castro, and Chavez. So a little of that had to do with that confrontation. And actually, at a time, they would say, Petro will have Colombia become like Venezuela right away. Fajardo, it will take a little longer. I'm warmer. But that's what happened. Now, what is happening in Venezuela is very painful. It's something that we cannot believe what is happening in there due to the Maduro government. And that affects Colombia's life. Latin America, actually, now it has become a regional problem in the sense that there are many Venezuelans coming out of Venezuela. And that's quite a challenge. But that is a dangerous mixture, because look at this. We had the peace treaty, the accords, and the way we're dealing with FARC and what happened in the countryside. Then we have narco-traffic. Duque has allied with Trump and saying they are going to be spraying the coca cultivos, crops. We had this, as I said, very superficially, but it has to do with the way they are supposed to fight what we call the minimal dose that was allowed by Colombian law for people to have of drugs, and the way they are going to fight it every day in the cities. And we have a mixture of confrontations right there. And Duque, I think he's a friendly person, and I have had the chance to talk to him. He's a good guy. It's not a guy that you say, well, this guy is really bad or something. He had a good spirit, but he has never been a leader. He has never governed. He's facing this condition. He has Uribe behind. The question that we are always asking in Colombia is he representing Uribe? Is he going to depart from Uribe? And we have had many questions accumulated through basically two months of government. And I think there is plenty of uncertainty in Colombia. Very difficult issues. Each one of them is a very difficult issue. And that's what remains to be seen from now on. The opposition hasn't done anything. It hasn't been the opposition working against him. But what we are seeing is writing. I mean, I would say that what we have is a huge question mark in Colombia of what is going to happen with all these issues. That's where we are standing right now. Okay? Well, thank you very much.
Before we conclude, two very brief comments. First, we are very appreciative that Sergio Fajardo was able to be with us. And second, this is the beginning of a conversation, not its end. I'm not saying that metaphorically. Sergio Fajardo will be back at the Center for Latin American Studies for the spring. He'll be teaching a special seminar 1 month. Go to the website, clas.berkeley.edu, if you'd like the details. And I can't resist 7 words you used to pull together a theme you dealt with. Change, politics, the means justify the ends. Thank you, and thank you, Sergio Fajardo.
Okay, thank you very much. One question, one final remark. I'm very glad to be here, and it's very dangerous when I come here because I start thinking about something that I said when we were in the presidential campaign. I said, I'm never going to be a candidate in my life. My dream was to be a chancellor, a rector of a university, to be able to work with young people, with teachers, professors. After all what I have learned throughout these 19 years, to go back to where I belong, to the university, and work with them. And that has been troublesome for me. And if I come here, I love it so much. I have so much fun. And I was telling my daughter, being a professor is a wonderful life. It's a noble life. and I love it. And if I were going to be, if I could live again, I would be a professor again. So it's very dangerous. When I come here, my life, my heart turns apart.